Thank you guys all so much for coming out, and thanks to Skip and Nikolai. This is really a great honor. It's almost too great of an honor, really. The book industry is stranger than I thought, and stranger than you may know. I've been working with Zondervan, my publisher, since September of 2007. I've been signed with my agent, Chip McGregor, since 2008. They've sent me 2 checks for 2 books that equaled my former annual salary, which that actually says more about the small size of the salary than the checks. But and that's before I quit my job to be a full-time writer and trophy husband. But this has all been going on, and I've never met any of the people at Zondervan, not a soul. I've never met my agent. I've only talked to him on the phone and through emails. And there's a very insecure part of me that thinks it may be a very elaborate prank by my friends. And I get an email that says, "Chad, my name is Skip Rutherford. I'm the Dean of the University of Arkansas Clinton School of Public Service, and we want you to be part of our renowned speaker series." And I was like, they've gone too far this time. I knew I would show up, and they're like, "What are you talking about?" But here I am, a Clinton speaker, so I guess they've gotten to Skip, really. I mean, he must be in on it now. Well, I really appreciate you guys coming out tonight. I think if God worked like a genie in a bottle, I wouldn't be here. Because if he had answered one prayer, one particular prayer of mine from 1990, there would have been no need for me to write this book. 1990, October 28th, I'm on my parents' couch, Sunday night football. It used to be on TNT. The Bengals were playing the Falcons. Who here remembers Deion Sanders? Okay, 3rd quarter, Deion catches a punt, makes a couple moves, breaks out into the open field, puts his hand on the back of his helmet, and he high steps the last 40 yards into the end zone, where he proceeds to do a very choreographed dance with a couple of teammates. And this went against everything I've ever been taught about, class and sportsmanship and how an athlete is supposed to behave himself on the football field. I thought it was the coolest thing I'd ever seen. I was going to be Deion Sanders for Glencoe Middle School. All fall, winter, spring, I'd be out in the yard, I'd throw passes up into the air, and then I would intercept them, and I would high step across my yard, and I'd go into the garage, and I would dance so no one could see me. And at night, I would just beg God to bless me with athletic ability that I obviously did not have. I was going to wear Christian T-shirts under my jersey, and I was going to thank God anytime anyone asked me about the game I just had. I mean, I was going to be Tim Tebow before Tim Tebow ever thought about being Tim Tebow. So late that summer, you have the JV sign up. I sign up for our junior varsity team, 8th grade. I was going to play cornerback. I was going to return kicks. I was going to return punts. I may even play receiver, run a reverse or something when they needed me. The day before practice, we're at the Glencoe Chevron. I'm pumping my mom's gas, and our junior high coach pulls up beside us. He waves at my mom, and he comes over to me, and he's like, "You ready to start practice tomorrow?" I was like, "Yes, sir. I can't wait." And he slapped me on the back, and he said, "Great. We're going to turn you into an all-county center." I was like, "No." I got in the car, and I was like, "Mom, Coach said something about me playing center." And it turns out my uncle was actually an all-county center. And folks around Glencoe still remembered that. And apparently my fate was sealed long before I ever signed up. I go to the first day of practice. Sure enough, they stick me with the offensive lineman to play center. Hated it. I mean, it was just blocking and being blocked for 2 hours. I was miserable. I got home and told Mom and Dad I was going to quit. And Dads never let you quit anything. Have y'all noticed this? And lots of people have these great stories where they wanted to quit and their parents or someone would not let them quit, and they continued, and then they have this wonderful. That's not what happened here. If I could go back and quit, I would have quit the first day. There's nothing redeeming about that 4 months that I had to play center. The day we picked numbers, I tried to get number 21, and he was like, offensive linemen have to be 50 to 79. So I got 54, and I mean, this is me. Even if I'd been good at it, I do not have a future playing center at any level of football. It's really that I was just tall and slow. So the reason I say that the book wouldn't exist is, and all I talk to in this book is fans. I didn't talk to coaches. I didn't talk to players, because the ones I know seem to have a much better perspective on sports than the fans I know. And, had God blessed me with the speed and everything that I was asking for, I may be here pitching some book on, my recovery from drug and sex addiction after a 13-year NFL career. But it wouldn't be this book. So I had to channel all this football passion somewhere, and it went into, fandom, being a fan, being a fanatic. Most of my family are Alabama fans. The ones that weren't never said anything about being an Auburn fan. I have a grandmother that I didn't know was an Auburn fan until I went to school at Auburn, and I was 20 years old. They just kept it from me. It was like she was a communist or something. And so I start devoting all this passion to cheering for Alabama. My granddad and my uncle would take me to about one game a year, usually, UT Chattanooga or one of the smaller homecoming games. I just loved it. I thought it was the greatest thing. And then in 1992, Bama won the national championship, and it was just wonderful. I still have my tape, my VHS tape of the Sugar Bowl, and you can't listen to it because I was rewinding and slow-moing and rewinding and slowing all the great plays. So it's just this garbled, Keith Jackson's garbled voice all through the tape. 93 was a season for Alabama. 94, going into the season, people were pretty excited. The uncle I was talking about, this is my Uncle Jimmy. It's my mother's brother. Awesome guy. He was the first person I knew that ever had a room in his house that was just totally dedicated to sports stuff. The posters and the autographs, and it was just the greatest thing for a 14, 15-year-old boy. He also had a lot of trouble with addiction, and it's something that it was weird for me being that young. I didn't know, I wanted to do something, but what do I do? I don't even know if I'm supposed to know. I can't talk to him about it, and it's just stuff that you hear your parents talking about. And what I decided to do was at church camp, summer of 1993, I had a good buddy whose older brother was also really struggling with addiction. And we came up with this plan that we were going to pray for our relatives. So throughout that whole next year, 93 and 94, we were keeping each other sort of accountable. Did you pray last night? Yeah. Did you pray? Yeah. And Good Friday, 94, we were at church, and spring in Alabama is probably like spring here. It's 50% chance if you're going to die in a tornado that day, no matter what day it is. And we go to church, and the first words out of the preacher's mouth is like, we're going to have to let y'all go, but we're going to have a quick invitation, and then we're going to run for our lives, because it was a pretty bad day in Alabama. So they played Just As I Am a little faster than we were used to. And sure enough, my buddy Ryan's brother walks down the aisle, and it was just the coolest thing. And the way that a 15-year-old's mind works actually is probably how my mind still works. But it's like, okay, we've both been praying the same amount. Ryan got what he was praying for, so what I'm praying for is going to happen next, obviously. And A couple months later, it's July of '94. My uncle was killed in a car wreck. It was late. It's like 4 in the morning. The police came to my grandparents who lived next door, his parents, and my grandmother screaming on the porch is what woke me up. And it seemed so unfair to me. Ryan and I had been playing by the same rules. We've been doing the same thing, and his prayers were answered, and my hopes and dreams were just crushed right in front of me. It was the first person close to me I'd ever lost. It was just really tough. And what I kind of did that fall was wrap myself up in the football team, Alabama's football team, because they weren't that good, but they kept winning. And when teams are like that, people start saying, "Hey, there's something special about this team. They won't give up." And I'm sure we've all done it with different teams. And obviously, what I'm thinking is, God's going to let my team win football games because He killed my uncle. And they kept winning, and I kept believing that. I was like, okay, I guess this is a fair trade. I don't know. And we beat Auburn. We go to the SEC championship game. We're ranked second or third and in line to beat Florida in the SEC game and go to the national championship game. But they lost to Florida. And the way I'd wrap myself up in that season, it was like my uncle getting killed all over again. It was just really hurt me. And I sort of just had a crisis of faith. I probably didn't go to church but maybe 3 times over the next 4 years. I was just bitter, a little confused, but mostly just bitter and angry. Still cared a lot about football. That was sort of my outlet. Back then, it's hard to even remember what it was like back then being a fan for me. I read a lot of newspapers. Recruiting was done in magazines. In Alabama, Forrest Davis was the big guy, and you'd get his recruiting magazine and read about all the recruits. A lot of sports radio. I had a job. I was a pharmacy delivery boy, so I got to drive around basically 4 hours a day delivering medicine and listening to sports radio out of Birmingham. And I was all set to go to the University of Alabama. I graduated from high school. I actually spent 2 years at the junior college in town because I'm not very smart. I didn't go there because I'm not smart. I'm actually not smart. I couldn't have gone to college, I don't think. 2 years at the junior college, and I have my acceptance letter to the University of Alabama. This is 1998. 2 friends and I go to campus to pick out an apartment. We found one that was close to Krispy Kreme, and we tried to sign a lease, but we weren't old enough. I think you had to be 21, so our parents were going to have to come back to co-sign the lease with us. We decided 2 weeks later we'd come back. So the week in between, I go to Auburn for the first time to visit some friends. And I loved every second of it. And I don't know, who is Arkansas's big rival? Who do y'all just hate? Texas, Ole Miss? Everyone? The Alabama-Auburn thing, it's intense. And when I got home and told my parents, I think I want to go to Auburn, they weren't happy. My mom really was not happy. And it kind of shocked me. I figured they'd be okay with it. And eventually I convinced them that I would go and be an engineer, of all things. And they were like, okay, you can go try to be an engineer. And, if we're being honest, and I have no reason not to be honest, a girl may have had something to do with my wanting to go to Auburn. It's actually not the girl that has the other one of these, but I met her there, so it works out. So I get to Auburn. I had 5 majors in my first 5 quarters. I lasted 10 weeks as an engineering student. A lot of people fail their first test in college. I don't know if I did or not. I didn't go back to get it. There's no way. There's literally no way I made better than a 0 because I did. I did not know what to put for any of the questions. It was Calculus 3, and that's the disservice the junior college did me. I had Calculus 1 and Calculus 2 at the junior college, and I made A's. And I took Calculus 3 at Auburn and made a 0 on the first test. So I actually have this sort of return to my faith at Auburn. This also has something to do with the aforementioned girl. She probably would not have dated me if I had not been going to church with her, so I started going to church with her. And you know, it sort of dawned on me that I was being a bit of an idiot, and you know, probably being a little immature about the whole thing, and sort of had this born again experience, I guess. I don't know how you'd say it, but you know, so I'm back with my faith. I'm at Auburn. I'm still kind of an Alabama fan, but I'm going to Auburn games. It's kind of a weird couple of years where I don't really care about football quite as much as I always had. It's probably spiritually the best 2 years of my life. And then, summer of 2001, I remember I was going to work at a FCA golf camp, and before I left, I went and bought an Auburn t-shirt because I wanted people to know I went to Auburn, and I could sort of just feel my mind switching over a little bit. And by that first football game of 01, I was, you know, decked out, orange and blue, screaming for Auburn in the Auburn student section. That night, Bama played South Carolina, and I was actually cheering against Alabama. And when they lost, it was strangely satisfying. You know, just a bizarre conversion story, but at this point, football starts to become more important to me probably than it ever had before. And a part of it was me trying to prove to my Auburn friends that I was actually an Auburn fan and not just faking it for probably the sake of a girl. 2002 was a good year for Auburn. 03 was awful. 2004, I have another experience where I think God is letting my football team win games. Auburn went 13-0 that year. And on the post-game show every week, they would show our team singing the fight song and then singing an old spiritual song that the chaplain had taught them. So I wasn't the only one convinced that Jesus wanted Auburn to win the national championship. But as most of you know, Auburn was third in the BCS and got left out. And I say in the book that I think God wanted us to win, but he didn't understand how the BCS worked. And, you know, I think that's completely understandable, even for an all-knowing deity. The internet made my fanaticism much worse than it ever was in the 90s. I pay $9 a month to subscribe to a website that ranks 17-year-old boys. Do you know how sketchy that sounds? They're actually football recruits, which makes it legal. The message boards, YouTube, it's just, you know, I would hate for my pastor to see a comparison of how much time I spend reading Auburn message boards to, you know, reading the Bible or a devotional or something, because it's so skewed. I'm on those boards constantly. And, you know, I'm going along. It's all okay. We're beating Alabama. We had a 6-game winning streak over Alabama. So even when Auburn had so-so years, it was still nice. I could still go home at Christmas and talk smack. 2008 comes. I call 2008 Auburn's Book of Job. It was awful. And I guess it wasn't that bad. It was 5-6, but it was just painful to watch. And the 6-game streak against Alabama came to an end with a 36-0 loss in Tuscaloosa, and I was just miserable that whole fall. I'd have trouble going to church on Sunday. And if I did get there, I was sulking, and I would sulk at work on Monday after a loss. And it bothered me. I started asking myself questions that you don't ask yourself when you're winning. Losing really brings out the introspection. Winning, you're just like, woo, I don't care. But losing, I was like, why do I care about this so much when it usually just makes me miserable? And so I started asking these questions, and I came up with this idea for the book. I was like, I'm going to go around the SEC. I'm going to meet people that are just like me, people that are crazy about their team, but are also Christians and love God, and maybe find someone out there that has this figured out a little bit better than I do. And a friend was like, yeah, that's like that AA program where alcoholics go around to different bars and see how other people drink. So maybe the premise makes no sense, what I wanted to do. But Zondervan gave me money, so I was going to do it anyway. During the summer of 2009, I started scheduling out my fall. I wanted to see Auburn play a lot. I wanted to see them play in Fayetteville. I wanted to see them play in Baton Rouge. But if I did that, it meant I would be in Gainesville for like the Charleston Southern game. And there'd be a lot of games that weren't really marquee games in the book. And I felt like it would do a disservice to the book. So I had to mark a few Auburn games off the schedule and try to make sure at least every game I was at was an SEC game. So I, at least do a service to the school. Because, the homecoming games is just a different atmosphere than if you're at a big SEC matchup. I started emailing churches around the SEC and campus ministries trying to find people like me, and the response was just crazy. I mean, within minutes I was getting emails back from people, hey, I know someone perfect for you. I know someone that would be great for your book. I'd be great for your book, just all that. And so I lined it all up. And in September of 2009, I went to Vanderbilt for the opener. And that was the one game that was a little iffy, Vanderbilt, Western Carolina. And that's actually how the book opens, which is, kind of a weird way to open up a book. But I get there, and I thought I had it all planned out. I was going to be staying at an apartment with these students. And it fell through. And the guy that had set me up, I ended up, the first night of this whole tour, I slept on a dorm room floor. And I remember thinking, this is an awful idea. I don't think I need to be doing this. Band parties were raging down below at the fraternity houses, and I couldn't sleep. But the next day at Vanderbilt was good, and the trips kept getting better and better. And I realized now, looking back, what I was trying to do at the beginning, I was looking for people that were more screwed up than I was, so I could feel better about myself. But I think that's human nature. I think we look around, we find someone that's a little bit worse than us, and we're like, well, we don't have to change. There's that guy, he's a lot worse than me. I met plenty of people like that were a lot more fanatical than I am. Jack Haynes is a guy that I stayed with in Columbia, South Carolina. He's a big South Carolina fan. He went to his first home game, first USC game when he was 8 years old. He's 63 now. The last 55 seasons, he's only missed 5 home games. And the basketball stats were even crazier. He's only missed, I think, 12 basketball games in 48 years. But he's also a big part of the pastoral care team at his church, very involved with his church. And, I can't stand here and condemn him for caring too much about football, because he obviously seemed to have a much more rounded life than I do. After I stopped comparing myself to people, I wanted formulas. That was the next thing I think I was really looking for. I kind of struggle with the concept of grace. I'm much more comfortable with karma as a whole. I would like to know exactly how much I can care about football, and I would like someone to say, hey, if you spend so much money on football tickets, you need to give this much money to the poor, and then you're good. You don't have to worry about anything. And I don't think that's the way it works either. And so I was going through all this in my head, and I was just as confused halfway through these trips as I was when I started them. Bama, Tennessee last year, that was the game I decided to go to Tuscaloosa for. Gary Rutledge played quarterback at Alabama in the early 70s. He was one of the wishbone quarterbacks. I'm good friends with his son-in-law, and he called me that week and was like, hey, Gary's got swine flu. You want his ticket? And I felt awful because I'd been praying all week for Bama players to get swine flu. And I thought maybe God mistook me and thought I meant former players, and Gary was now suffering. But are there any Bama fans here? No, that's actually a joke. I have to explain that in Alabama sometimes because people really start to give me mean looks. That's just a joke. So I'm at the Bama-Tennessee game. That was one of Bama's few close games last year. Tennessee had a field goal to win the game, but it was blocked. Bama won. Kevin and I are walking out of the stadium, and he starts talking to me. He's like, you know, y'all used to make me feel terrible. It's like, what are you talking about? He's like, well, when I first met y'all, Auburn had this big winning streak over Alabama, and y'all made me feel like everything in my life, my car, my job, my clothes, was inferior to y'all's because your football team was better than mine. It's like, I didn't make you feel that way. And I don't think I did. I don't think any of us ever really did. But that's the way Kevin felt. And, you know, later that night I'm watching the Auburn-LSU game. Auburn's just getting pounded. And I turn it off. I call my wife, and we just kind of sulk together for a minute. I was like, I don't even want to write this stupid book anymore. I don't want to see another football game the rest of the year. And when we hung up, I was sitting there and I was thinking about all this and thinking what Kevin said and thinking about how I felt at the time. And I realized I was starting to feel like everything in my life was inferior to Kevin's. My job, my clothes, my car, my wife, my kids. I don't even have kids. My dogs. And he certainly didn't make me feel that way. And you know, that's when it hit me that I get so much of my self-worth from my football team. And it was just kind of scary. A lot of my identity and you know, the way I see myself and the way that I think people see me is wrapped up in whether Auburn is winning or losing football games. And I don't even care that much about the game of football, is what I realized. I mean, obviously I care about football. I mean, I've got paintings on my wall at my home, and I went to all these games. But when I really get interested in something, you know, I study it, and I study the history, and I want to learn the ins and outs. Like, I'm a big golfer. I read about golf history, and I study the golf swing, and I actually probably know more about Star Wars than I do about running an offense or football. I just like the way I feel when Auburn's winning football games more than anything else. I have friends that when we hired the offensive coordinator before Malzahn, I can't remember his name, Tony Franklin. When we hired him, they went out and bought his DVD set to learn the offense that we'd be running, just so they would know what's going on when they're in the stands. And I couldn't care less. I watch the ball, and if it crosses the goal line, I scream. And if it doesn't, I sit on my hands. But I have a theory that there's a lot of people that are just like me, because if you really love something, if you love the sport of football, I think you would want to understand it, the rules and the offenses. Say a quarterback takes the snap and rolls way out of the pocket and then throws the ball out of bounds. Is that intentional grounding? No. Why is it not intentional grounding? Because he was outside the tackle box. Next time you're at a game, a quarterback is going to roll outside the pocket, and he's going to throw the ball out of bounds, and someone sitting in your section is going to go insane. Like someone just ran over their dog. Because they think it should be intentional grounding. And you'll see, I mean, blood vessels will be bursting on their head that flag being thrown and them winning that game is the most important thing to them. And they don't even understand a very basic rule of the game. And that's me sometimes. I need my team to win because I need to feel good about myself. So the rest of the season I went through with sort of that in mind. And, the book's God and Football. I'm a Christian. I'm not really here to evangelize anyone. You live in Arkansas. You know what Christianity is, I would imagine. I live in Alabama. I think most people I talk to. And so you know what I profess to believe. And for me to try to find my worth as a person in a game being played by college kids is scary to me. And I've talked to people from around the country, not from the South, and they kind of snicker at that. They're like, "You people are just goofy with your football." But it's not just football. I think people do it with all sorts of stuff, their jobs or their marriage or whatever. They're hunting, anything that I think when you start looking to it outside of God for your self-worth, I think that's when problems start. So towards the end, I spent some time with pastors and evangelists, and a good friend of mine that's an evangelist in Birmingham, he summed up my book in just one sentence, and I apologize to you that I've already paid $14 for 260 pages now that I'm about to sum it up. But he said, football is a great hobby, but it's a terrible God. And I think for me, I totally agree with what he said there. I think it is a great hobby, and I'm very thankful that I live in the South and I get to experience all this passion and pageantry of it's a sport like none other. But I'm also thankful that it's not my God, and I hope going forward in seasons to come that I'll be able to keep that in mind. I'd be glad to answer any questions you guys have about the book or my trips or whatever.
One second, Johnny. Let me get a microphone to you. Bill. Microphone. Yeah. Right over here. Bill, right here. Up front. Up front. Up front. Johnny, thanks.
I read your book a month ago, and you mentioned when Alabama beat Miami in the national championship game. A couple months afterward, I got a tape of Gene Stallings talking about his faith. And I'm wondering, for you growing up, what did you see as far as with Gene Stallings, especially with his son Johnny, and as far as with you in terms of your faith looking back from now to then?
Yeah, Gene Stallings he's a great man. I didn't know a whole lot about him when I was growing up. I just knew he was the coach, and he was winning football games, so I thought he was great. I didn't even really know a lot about John Mark until later in life, and then you start to read about their relationship and how special that was. And I hear Coach Stallings on the radio on Paul Feinbaum from time to time now, and he seems like an incredible man, and he was a great coach at Alabama for sure.
Over here.
In your travels around, did you get the impression that people generally feel like when they're praying for wins and that actually works, makes a difference in the outcome?
That was one of the questions I ask everyone about praying for their team, and the answers fell into four categories. There was one group that said, God's got too much more important stuff going on than football for me to pray about football. And I agree with that to a point. I don't feel like God can only hear one thing at a time, and so I feel like if you prayed about football, he'd probably hear it. The next group prayed for no injuries. A lot of people, that's what they would pray for, would be no injuries, which I have mixed feelings about that too, because it's 300-pound men running as fast as they can and crashing into each other, and then we're praying that they don't get hurt. Of course they're going to get hurt. It's sort of almost, it was testing God there. The third group prayed for their team to play to the best of their abilities. And everyone that told me that, I told them that was a very sneaky way of praying for their team to win. And then the last group actually admitted that they prayed for their team to win football games. And those, it seemed to be about 25% in each group.
I probably have some similar Arkansas characteristics to your Auburn, but my wife is from Birmingham, and they are Alabama fans, and so I do understand the division you talk about. We were riding through Alabama one night, and it was about 2 years ago, listening to sports talk radio, and it was a coach's show, and there was the Alabama show was on one station, and Tuberville was on the other station. So this was when Tuberville was still there, and someone called in and was praising Tuberville because, and the phrase he used was, "You're teaching them the Lord." And I just thought that we use that phrase in our family a lot now, not positively, but rather negatively. And I thought, you may be able to comment on something like that. So here you got a fan believing that the real value of this coach is that he was teaching the Lord to his players. So what do you think about that?
That was a big thing with Coach Tuberville. He brought in a chaplain when he was at Ole Miss, and I think it was the first. Yeah, and now I think just about every SEC school has a full-time chaplain on staff that's usually paid through FCA, but working with the schools full-time. I hear that a lot, especially with Auburn and with Chet Williams, who's our chaplain. You hear it more when you're winning games. If I'm being honest, thinking back to 2008, I don't remember people calling into the coaching show and be like, "Coach, this season's going terrible, but you're teaching them the Lord, so we're okay with it." But it goes back to that 04 season that I was talking about, and how we actually have a DVD at home put out by the Auburn Network called "Hard Fighting Soldiers," and that's the name of the hymn that they were singing in the locker room. And it really ties that spiritual aspect into the football team, and it's probably skirting a thin line there, but yeah, I'm not surprised you heard that call. You hear it probably every coach's show as long as Auburn's winning.
Over here.
What are your thoughts? When I was growing up, it was traditional to do the Lord's Prayer before games. Have you, kind of in the locker room, have you noticed that that's a trend that's still evident in college? And also, answer that.
Obviously I didn't have a chance to be in any of the locker rooms. I do notice a lot of the teams, when they go out on the field now during warm-ups, like groups, like the wide receivers will all huddle around and pray. And I don't know if it's the Lord's Prayer or whatnot, but you see a lot of praying, a lot of the teams praying, a lot of the players praying. Only two schools that I remember, it was South Carolina and Tennessee actually still had a prayer over the loudspeaker before the game. Someone would give an invocation. None of the other SEC schools did that I can remember.
What are your observations on the fingers pointed up after score, or kneeling, or the cross, or
That's a good question. He was asking about pointing up after a touchdown, or doing the sign of the cross, or Tebow with his eye black. And people ask me about Tebow a lot, what I think about Tebow with his eye black and being so outspoken. And I think it's great. I think Tebow was probably a very genuine person. I think if he wasn't, his teammates would have saw through it. I don't think they would have followed him the way they did if he was sort of faking this the whole time. And I think he's using the gifts he has to glorify God, and I think God gets glory from it. The part that's a little weird for me is, when I'm 15 or when I'm 32, and I see some athlete score 5 touchdowns and thank Jesus for it, it doesn't really make me want to feed the hungry and clothe the poor. It makes me want to score 5 touchdowns and thank Jesus for it. And that's my problem. And I think that's the society's problem, how much importance we put on football. A lot of people think that being a star quarterback that thanks Jesus is the best possible thing you could be in life, and it's probably not the case. But that's not Tim Tebow's fault. I think he's using the gifts he has to glorify God, and good for him. And should probably be doing the same, and my gifts are obviously not running over linebackers, even if I wish it was.
Will you kind of talk a little bit about why you think Tebow had such a negative reaction? Every good football player on opposing teams has negative reactions, but he seemed to garner more negative reactions when he was crying at the Alabama game that was put over all over the internet and things like that.
You know, I think it was more the media swirling around Tim Tebow. You couldn't turn on the television and not see Tim Tebow, and you know that's not Tim Tebow's fault. Everywhere I went last year, you know, I'd have talked to most of the people I spent time with last year, talked to them about Tebow, and they're like, you know, we would love for Tim Tebow to be our quarterback or be our son or marry our daughter, but we're sick of hearing about him. And, you know, I think after the Bama game last year when they whipped Florida and he's crying, I think, you know, people got a little bit of joy out of that just because they were so sick of hearing about Tebow. But it just meant they were going to have to hear about him more. We're getting emails of video of him crying, but at least it was different, I guess.
In the back.
Thank you. I'm a student here at the Clinton School, and we're really happy that you're here, especially those of us who went to SEC schools. But my question, I guess, is, of these 12 schools that you went and visited, did you find like one or two that really just stood out as those, I mean, the ultimate fanaticism, I guess? Like
LSU.
The ultimate fan, really?
Here's my LSU story. Tricia, my wife, and I went to the 2003 Auburn LSU game, and we said we would never, ever go back to Baton Rouge, no matter what. Someone actually tried to buy my friend's wife when we were walking out. They asked how much he would take for her. And that's actually the only Auburn game we've ever left early. We left in the third quarter. LSU scored, went up 31-7 or 24-7, and we didn't even say a word. We just looked at each other, and we got up and left. And, you know, I wouldn't have gone back if it wasn't for this. But what was great, I realized I didn't have to go back as an Auburn fan. I could go back to LSU, whoever, and pretend to be an LSU fan for a day. So I went to see LSU play number 1 Florida. It was number 4 versus number 1. I got a student ticket, so I was in the LSU student section, which is the wildest student section in the world, and I'm 32 years old. It was so much fun. You know, LSU, have any of you been to Baton Rouge to a game? It's kind of scary. They're a little intimidating, but I tell people now it's kind of like a haunted house. It's like they put on masks and they try to scare you, but they're not really going to hurt you, I don't think. So I had a blast at the LSU game, and I went back this year for a book signing, and then we actually had LSU students staying with us last week when Auburn played LSU, and we are tentatively scheduled to go to the Auburn LSU game next year and stay with these friends that I've met, at which point I'm sure we'll say we're never going to go to Baton Rouge again. But, you know, you just kind of got to look past the tiger bait and all that stuff. We were talking about this earlier. My wife and I went to Europe this summer, and we were in Florence, Italy, and I had an Auburn t-shirt on, and this little kid walks by, and we hear, tiger bait. And I looked up. So.
You have time for one more? Here we go. Or two. We'll go here and then right there.
Yeah, I was at a high school game a few weeks ago, and one boy was unconscious, knocked out. And it was nice to see both teams kneel with their team on the field. Mm-hmm. And so I thought they're learning respect for the other players and the seriousness of what it could have been. He was out for minutes.
Yeah.
And so it's nice to see, and I think sometimes the media doesn't show that. Mm-hmm. And that's too bad that people don't see it, because they don't want to see, the media doesn't want to show anything religious. But it wasn't just religious, it was respectful to the player.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying earlier about the players. I mean, usually after a football game, the players are shaking hands and the fans are fighting. we're the ones that seem to not be able to handle the loss or the win very well. You're talking about injuries. It's interesting this week. Auburn last year had a player break his neck in the Ole Miss game, and the Ole Miss running back was laying on top of him, or laying under him, I believe. And they said had he moved, he probably would have really damaged the spinal cord. But the running back just laid there until they were able to get him off on a stretcher, and the guy made a full recovery, and he's actually playing in Auburn's secondary right now after breaking his neck last year. But that's a cool story, though. One more, last one.
Well, first of all, I'm Auburn, class of 74.
War Eagle.
War Eagle. My wife's class of 74. Grew up an Alabama fan, but she's went to Auburn. My question is, I read your book. My question is, after having gone through and written the book, how has it really changed your perspective as far as God and football, and balancing those, the way that I act on Saturday versus the way I act on Sunday?
I was at a book signing in Gainesville 2 weeks ago, and I was signing a book for a lady, and she asked me, she's like, so, do you handle losses better than you used to? And I was like, I don't know. Auburn hasn't lost yet since I wrote the book. And, her theory was, she's like, well, maybe God's setting you up for some big disappointment that you'll have to deal with later this season. To which I replied, get behind me, Satan. It's a good question, and honestly, I don't know. Winning's different. This excitement's different, and I think I'm doing an okay job with it. I am certainly excited about the football team, but I don't go to games anymore without thinking about all this. It's kind of always in the back of my mind now. It's a running conversation, and when I notice myself going down scary paths, I catch it myself. And my wife's the same way. Auburn-Clemson game this year, when we were down 17-0, she said that she started thinking, I hate my job. And then she's like, wait, my job has nothing to do with Clemson beating Auburn. And but and we've had close games this year. A lot of times where it looks like we weren't going to win, and it hasn't bothered me that much. I've kind of just laughed through most of the games, and I still get excited and I scream and yell and jump. And that's what I was afraid I was going to lose with this. I thought if I did this and I got a better perspective, then I wouldn't be able to enjoy when Auburn won because I wouldn't care as much. But like I say in the book, we're Southerners and we're passionate people, and we're going to be excited when we win. And I'll be mad when we lose, but if I'm over it by the time I get in bed, then that's okay, I think, because losing a football game is disappointing, but it doesn't need to go to the next day and the next. So I think I'm getting better.
Chad, tell us about your next project.
I have a proposal in at Zondervan for a book on rivalries, and not just SEC football, but all sports: Yankees, Red Sox, Duke, Carolina. The Iron Bowl would still be in it. With the idea being that this book's sort of why do we love, and the next one will be why do we hate. Because rivalries, I think, bring out the best in sports, but the worst in fans. I know it does with me, and it would take a broader look at racism and sectarianism in society, but just through the eyes of sports rivalries. That's the plan, at least.
This is a great book. It will make a great gift for the holidays. Ladies and gentlemen, Chad Gibbs, God in Football.